So committee will come to order, and I want to apologize for being a bit late. We did have some votes on the floor, so I appreciate your indulgence. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1994, as we all know, the East African nation of Rwanda experienced one of the most horrific genocides in modern times. An estimated 800,000 Rwandans, mostly ethnic Tutsis and moderates among the ethnic Hutus, were brutally murdered in a state-backed extermination campaign that lasted for months. Hutu-Tutsi tensions, of course, date back to colonial times when the Belgians created a superior class composed of Tutsis, shutting out Hutus from government jobs and higher education, despite the Hutus comprising about 85% of the population. In 1959 and in 1960, tensions among the Hutus exploded in a campaign that left 20,000 Tutsis dead and created about 300,000 Tutsi refugees. As with this earlier genocide, the international community watched largely from the sidelines during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, as the death toll rose from April until July of that year, until the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, defeated the Hutu-led government military. More than 2 million mostly Hutu refugees flooded into the Democratic Republic of Congo, leading to continuing problems in that country. The RPF-led Rwandan government has criticized the United Nations for sheltering Hutu participants in the genocide and for allowing them to arm in refugee camps. Over the years, the RPF has used the guilt of the international community as a shield to prevent criticism of its action. UN Ambassador Samantha Power referred to Ambassador Susan Rice and her colleagues in the Clinton administration in the 1990s as bystanders to genocide. She quotes Dr. Rice in the 2002 book saying, "If we use the word genocide and we are seen as doing nothing, and what will be the effect on the November congressional election?" she asked. Part of Rice's team during those years was Gail Smith, the current nominee to head the U.S. Agency for International Development. As far back as May of 1998, I chaired a hearing, and I chaired many hearings on the genocide, but at this one included testimony about the willful U.S. neglect in preventing the Rwandan genocide. As recounted in the issue of New Yorker magazine at the time, a high-ranking Rwandan informant had warned the UN leadership, including Kofi Annan. We actually had a hearing on the famous fax that was sent, and we had the reporter who broke that story, and the at a hearing, and the United States about preparations for killing 3 months before they actually began. And we all will recall that the UN peacekeepers had actionable information that went unacted upon. Furthermore, the United States has been accused of not merely of inaction, but also of obstructing preemptive multilateral efforts to quell the crisis. Some have alleged that, in the words of Refugees International President Lionel Rosenblatt, who also testified at my hearings, and he said, and I quote in pertinent part, "The ball was not only dropped by the United States, it was blocked by the United States." Paul Kagame, now president of Rwanda, was hailed as one of Africa's new leaders by Dr. Rice and her team during the 1990s, and there has been no apparent change in their high opinion of him since then, despite what Deputy Assistant Secretary Robert Jackson describes as several public administration statements related to human rights concerns and the ongoing dialogue with the Rwandan government. Matter of fact, Secretary Jackson, I'm very glad that you very clearly and unambiguously point out that activities that are seen by the government as possible threats of national security or the political dominance of the governing RPF are often met with intolerance and harsh punishments. And you point out again, over the past year, Rwandans have quietly reported the disappearances and suspected deaths of family members at the hands of the Rwandan security services. These reports, as you go on to say, come from a wide cross-section of Rwandan society, cutting across geographical, socioeconomic, and ethnic lines. In the Human Rights Report, it is clear, a little bit ambiguous the way it's written. It says there are fewer reports of disappearances and politically motivated abductions or kidnappings than in previous years. But local human rights organizations ceased investigating disappearances in 2012 after reporting pressure from the government officials, including threats and allegations of treason. President Kagame, I would go on to say, has been considered a hero on the international stage and has long been immune and I say this regrettably, to public criticism. However, human rights reports about abuses in Rwanda have grown over the years. And as I just quoted, there was much been said by our Assistant Secretary and others within the administration. In recent years, there have been credible reports that the RPF government has commissioned assassins to kill dissidents living in exile who criticize the government or attempt to form political associations or parties. Several years ago, our committee chairman, Ed Royce, and I were told face-to-face by Paul Rusena of Hotel Rwanda fame that the Rwandan government had targeted him and was behind several attempts on his life in Belgium. I mean, people can snicker and laugh, but frankly, he told us that, and he was very worried about his own personal safety. In early 2014, former Rwandan intelligence chief Faustin Kayumba, who had been living in exile in South Africa, was found murdered in his hotel room in Johannesburg. Kayumba was one of two dissidents. One of our witnesses today, former Rwandan Major Robert Higero, says he was asked to have killed. He was asked to be the assassin. The assassination plot, he revealed, was investigated and substantiated in a series of articles in Canada's Globe and Mail newspaper, which interviewed Rwandan exiles in South Africa and in Belgium. Since 2012, this subcommittee has held a series of hearings on the violence perpetuated by various militia in eastern DRC. Perhaps the best known of them, the so-called M23, was supported by Rwanda. This Congress has enacted restrictions on some military assistance to Rwanda in response to its involvement in militia activity in the DRC, and involvement in resource smuggling from that country as uncovered in several UN reports. These charges of serious human rights and other abuses will be troubling in any case, but Rwanda is a country that has enjoyed significant U.S. and international support. By largely avoiding criticism of Rwandan human rights issues, the Bush and Obama administrations raised appropriations to Rwanda from $39 million in 2003 to $188 million. And some of it is for very laudable goals, like UN peacekeeping and some of the health initiatives, including food security. But again, some of it has been for other issues. Rwanda, due to donor aid, political stability, and favorable investor policies, has grown by an average of 8% over the last decade. Yet donors began reducing or redirecting funds in 2012 because of Rwanda's role in supporting M23. The growing reports of human rights abuses also are leading to caution among donor nations about directly supporting the Rwandan government. And this hearing is going to focus on that. We have two very distinguished witnesses I will introduce shortly. I'd like to yield to our distinguished ranking member, Karen Bass.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your leadership and for holding today's hearing on developments in Rwanda, providing us with the opportunity to discuss the nation's challenges. While Rwanda is geographically a small nation, its condition and role in the stability of the Great Lakes region is critical. I'd also like to thank our distinguished witnesses today, including Ambassador Jackson and Steve Fieldstein from the Department of State, as well as several members of the Rwandan diaspora and the international human rights community. I look forward to hearing your varied perspectives on both the successes and challenges of developments in Rwanda. As I often say, Mr. Chair, there's lots of challenges on the continent of Africa, and I'm always concerned that focusing on those challenges, while very important, it's also important to talk about where there have been some developments. And part of the irony of Rwanda, in just 2 decades since the tragic events of the 1994 genocide, the economy has been a bright spot on the continent and has maintained steady growth every year. According to the World Bank, Rwanda is on track to meet most of the MDG goals by the end of 2015, and I know reports are that the poverty rate has dropped. From a business perspective, Rwanda is often considered one of the easiest places to do business in sub-Saharan Africa. One of the things that has always been interesting to me, as I have received many international delegations and many delegations from Africa, is Rwanda has made incredible strides in empowering women to occupy seats in government. In recent years, the parliament has grown to include almost 2/3 majority of women as they hold 64% of the seats in parliament. But with all of this, the Rwandan government has also faced accusations from many in the international community of being authoritarian and heavy-handed in its repression of dissent and political opposition. This repression has included threats to journalists, detainment of political opponents, and even the killing of political dissenters. In view of both the spectacular economic and development gains in Rwanda and the international community's concerns over human rights and freedom of speech, association, and assembly in the country, I hope that today's discussion will help to illuminate the challenges in Rwanda and also perhaps provide a pathway forward for where U.S. foreign policy should go. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. I'd like to now introduce our first two very distinguished witnesses, beginning with the acting administrator for African Affairs, Robert Jackson, Ambassador Jackson, who is currently, as I said, the acting administrator, assistant, I should say. He previously served as ambassador to Cameroon, as well as deputy chief of mission and charge at the U.S. embassies in Morocco and Senegal. He also served at U.S. embassies in Burundi, Zimbabwe, Portugal, and Canada. At the State Department headquarters, he has worked in the commercial and consular sections and conducted officer training. He has also performed oversight work in the Office for the Promotion of Democracy and Human Rights after 9/11. Ambassador Jackson has appeared before this subcommittee several times, and we're always appreciative of his insights and his recommendations. Then we'll hear from Mr. Stephen Feldstein, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, is responsible for its work in Africa on international labor affairs and international religious freedom. Previously, Mr. Feldstein served as Director of the Office of Policy in the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning at USAID, and served as counsel on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he oversaw a portfolio that included oversight of all U.S. foreign assistance agencies, budgets, and programs, State Department management, operations, and international organizations. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss U.S. efforts to support the Rwandan government and people as they continue rebuilding their political, economic, and social structures following the 1994 genocide. In the interest of respecting the committee's time, Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit a longer version of my testimony for the record, which you have, and just read a shorter version.
Without objection, so ordered.
For Rwanda, as for many countries in Africa, our policy is built around four interdependent and mutually reinforcing objectives. One, to strengthen democratic institutions. Two, to spur economic growth, trade, and investment. Three, to advance peace and security. And four, to promote opportunity and development. Rwanda has made enormous strides in spurring economic growth and promoting development, while we continue to encourage further progress in ensuring that Rwanda plays a constructive role in the region and respects human rights and democratic principles. Let me first talk about Rwanda's economic and development successes. Rwanda has become a model of inclusive economic growth and a world leader in leveraging development assistance into socioeconomic gains for the vast majority of its people. The United States and Rwanda share the belief that trade, investment, technological development, and market forces are keys to Rwanda's long-term economic development. The commitment of the United States to supporting Rwanda's economic and social development is strong. U.S. aid assistance to Rwanda's education sector more than doubled from fiscal year 2012 to present, and many American companies and community service organizations that have started operations in Rwanda in recent years. We have been proud to partner with Rwanda in the last decade as its economy has grown at an average of over 7% per year, as its infant and child mortality rates have been halved, and as HIV and malaria rates have been reduced dramatically, with help from the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, and the President's Malaria Initiative, PMI, respectively. With regard to Rwanda's contribution to regional peace and security, I would highlight that Rwanda is one of the world's most active and effective UN peacekeepers, the fifth largest contributor of troops in the world, despite its small size and population. Its peacekeepers serve in many of the world's most complicated conflicts, including the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Darfur, and frequently distinguish themselves by a willingness to take strong actions to protect civilians under imminent threat of violence. We have recognized Rwanda's leading role in peacekeeping through its designation as a priority partner in President Obama's Africa Peacekeeping Rapid Response Partnership. At the same time, we continue to encourage Rwanda to play a constructive role in the Great Lakes region, and we were pleased when Rwanda ended its support to the M23 rebellion in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and supported the Nairobi declarations that ended that conflict. We share Rwanda's continued concerns over the presence in Eastern DRC of the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or FDLR, the armed group, and we are encouraging the DRC government, together with the UN peacekeeping operation MONUSCO, to carry out effective counterinsurgency efforts against this abhorrent armed group. In the current crisis in Burundi, we have encouraged all countries in the region, including Rwanda, not to take unilateral actions and to work through multilateral frameworks to support a peaceful resolution to the internal conflict stemming from Burundian President Nkurunziza's decision to seek a third term in violation of the Arusha Accord. Unfortunately, however, Rwanda's record of building democratic institutions and ensuring full respect for human rights is mixed. In response to and to protect against further destructive cycles of mass violence, the Rwandan government has developed a strong state with an intense commitment to internal safety and security, national unity, and socioeconomic development. As a result, on the positive side, Rwanda is a country with low corruption and a strong record for combating not only corruption, but demanding high accountability and performance from its public officials, as well as ensuring prosecution for those who break the law. Violent crime rates are extremely low and have been dropping consistently over the last decade. Rwanda is a leader in combating trafficking in persons, having put in place a comprehensive nationwide anti-trafficking plan that it is aggressively implementing with NGOs and partners. Rwanda is also a leader in promoting the rights of disabled persons, and especially for elevating women to position of leadership in government. As Congresswoman Bass noted, 63% of its parliament is female. Thus, Rwanda boasts the highest number of women lawmakers anywhere in the world, and the rights of LGBTI persons are respected. There is also another side to the security coin, however. Activities that are seen by the government as possible threats to national security or the political dominance of the governing Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, are often met with intolerance and harsh punishment. In some of these cases, suspected wrongdoers are submitted to the Rwandan judicial system in a transparent manner, but in other cases they are not. Over the past year, Rwandans have quietly reported the disappearance and suspected deaths of family members at the hands of the Rwandan security services. These reports, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, come from a wide cross-section of Rwandan society, cutting across geographical, socioeconomic, and ethnic lines. In recent years, domestic human rights organizations have found it increasingly difficult to monitor and report on human rights violations and abuses. Among international human rights organizations, only Human Rights Watch maintains a permanent presence in Rwanda. Its staff reports surveillance and occasional harassment by government officials and security services. Restrictions on press freedoms in Rwanda continue to be a serious concern. Human rights concerns are part and parcel of our ongoing dialogue with the Rwandan government, however. We are concerned that political competition in Rwanda continues to be limited. There are 11 registered political parties. However, 10 are aligned with the ruling RPF and a government of consensus. Only one, the Democratic Green Party, which advocates for policy alternatives and has taken a position against the removal of term limit positions in the Constitution, has no seats in Parliament. We believe democracy is strengthened by inclusive political processes and active debate between parties and citizens. We continue to encourage the Rwandan government to ensure protection of political freedoms, particularly in the lead up to elections. The upcoming 2017 presidential election will be pivotal for Rwanda's future. Our consistent message to President Kagame and the government of Rwanda, as it has been with other leaders in Africa facing elections, is that political space should be open to opposition parties that embrace peaceful, democratic dialogue and transition. This includes ensuring freedom of expression, press freedoms, the ability of citizens to criticize the government and ruling party, and the ability of all to campaign freely for the candidates and causes they believe in. We also believe that neither parties nor individuals should seek to change constitutions to extend their terms in office for personal or political gain. This is a principle that we uphold throughout the world. As we are sadly witnessing in Burundi, there are serious negative consequences when one group limits the ability of others to participate fully in the political process. In our view, the best way to ensure long-term stability and prevent violence is by making sure that all peaceful voices are allowed to speak and be heard. So, while we applaud Rwanda's great development success, we should not ignore the need for strong and transparent democratic institutions that will lay the foundation for long-term stability and economic growth. As Rwandans have shown by building a strong and dynamic country over the course of 2 decades, they have the ability to meet difficult challenges beyond all expectations. We will continue to work in partnership with Rwanda to help it build the prosperous and democratic country that Rwandans seek. I thank the committee.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so very much for your testimony. Mr. Feldstein.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass. Thank you for holding this important hearing. I know it's been several years since the committee last held a dedicated hearing on Rwanda, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Like Ambassador Jackson, I have a longer version of testimony for the record I'd like to submit. Great. Rwanda holds a very personal connection for me. 15 years ago, I first went to Rwanda as a fellow with the International Rescue Committee. I spent a year in the country supporting its efforts to recover from war and genocide. Living in Rwanda had a profound impact on me and has been a key inspiration for my decision to pursue a career in foreign policy and human rights. Rwanda's progress since the 1994 genocide has been remarkable, with an annual growth rate that has averaged 7%, with 1 million people removed out of extreme poverty, with having achieved close to 100% primary school enrollment, and with infant mortality down over 60% since 1990, the accomplishments have been significant. Several years ago, I had paid a return visit to Kigali, and I found a city profoundly changed. Modern office towers have replaced dilapidated buildings. The streets were spotless, thanks in part to a widely acclaimed ban on plastic bags. New businesses seem to be springing up daily, such as coffee ventures supplying top-quality beans to U.S. brands like Starbucks and Peet's. But this is only part of the story. Alongside Rwanda's development progress, there have been equally consistent efforts to reduce space for independent voices and to diminish the ability of the media, opposition groups, and civil society to operate. This space matters. It is essential not only for democratic progress, but for cementing Rwanda's impressive economic and development gains. We see 3 key trends in Rwanda's human rights situation. First, political space in Rwanda and the overall human rights environment continues to shrink. Second, this trend is reinforcing the wrong lessons for Rwanda, particularly that a country can continue to experience robust economic growth and foreign investment even while repressing its citizens further and reducing democratic space. This is not a sustainable path. At some point, if unchecked, human rights violations will begin to affect Rwanda's economic performance, stability, and foreign investment. Third, Rwanda's human rights record is setting a disturbing precedent for the region and continent. Other countries are carefully watching Rwanda's model of economic liberalization and political repression. My counterparts frequently point to Rwanda and question whether protecting the rights of their citizens matters if they can achieve substantial economic development. The answer, of course, is that protecting the rights of all of Rwanda's citizens and residents matters immensely to Rwanda's long-term stability and prosperity, to its continued positive economic trajectory, and to whether other countries recognize they can follow a similar path to greater prosperity. Rwanda can be a model for the region, or it can slip backwards over time, never truly fulfilling its potential. We have articulated our concerns about Rwanda's human rights record for many years directly to Rwanda's senior leaders, including President Kagame. And we have highlighted Rwanda's deteriorating situation through the State Department's annual human rights report. The department's 2013 report for Rwanda noted that the government harassed, arrested, and abused political opponents and human rights advocates, disregarded the rule of law, and placed significant restrictions on freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and the press. It also highlighted reports that arbitrary or unlawful killings took place both inside and outside Rwanda. The credibility of elections provides an important indication of the level of space for independent voices and views. Unfortunately, presidential elections in 2010 and parliamentary elections in 2013 were beset by irregularities both in the pre-electoral period and on Election Day. This includes suppressing and denying registration to opposition parties, security officials present in polling booths, multiple voting, and local election officials filling up ballots in the absence of voters. Rwanda's next presidential election is in 2017, and we are cautiously hopeful that this election will mark an improvement upon previous contests. Our concerns about restrictions on fundamental freedoms extend beyond electoral processes. The U.S. has expressed deep concern about the arrest and disappearance of dozens of Rwandan citizens, as well as credible reports that individual journalists are being threatened and sometimes directly censored. Rwandan journalists routinely self-censor their work, and some journalists have been detained or threatened for reporting deemed to be critical of the government. Last year, the Rwandan government shut down the BBC Kinyarwanda broadcast because of a controversial documentary about President Kagame and the genocide. We are concerned that since establishing the Rwanda Media Commission as an independent body, the government has interfered with its work, undermined its role as the sole regulator of media content, and at times threatened commissioners. We are also deeply troubled by what appears to be politically motivated murders of prominent Rwandan exiles. This includes the December 2013 killing of former Rwandan government official Colonel Patrick Karegeya, who was found dead in a hotel room in South Africa. Months later, armed men raided the South African home of former Rwandan Army Chief of Staff Kayumba Nyamwasa, who had been previously targeted for assassination attempts. President Kagame's 2014 statements about consequences for those who betray Rwanda has further heightened these concerns. Also of deep concern are dozens of corpses, some bound and wrapped in sacks, that appeared in Lake Rweru along the border between Rwanda and Burundi in 2014. 4 of those bodies were recovered and buried in Burundi. Fishermen reported that on 2 separate nights in September, Rwandan Marines attempted to exhume the bodies, allegedly to return them to Rwanda. In December, Burundi accepted an offer of forensic assistance funded by the U.S. and several other donors for an African Union-led investigation into the 4 recovered bodies. Rwandan officials stated that the government also supported a joint investigation, but no investigation has been conducted. The U.S. continues to press the African Union to move forward with an investigation and accountability for those responsible. Rwanda is an important ally. It is a respected contributor to peacekeeping missions. It has rebuilt itself from genocide, and it has achieved impressive development and economic gains. I believe there's a bright future ahead for its people, which is why Rwanda's current human rights situation is so personally disappointing to me. Ensuring respect for freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and respect for the rule of law is essential for cementing and building from these gains. The United States will continue to urge Rwanda to respect the rights of all its citizens. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.
Very much for your testimony and for being so thoroughly candid about your personal as well as professional disappointment when it comes to the human rights situation as practiced by the Rwandan government. Let me just ask you, one of our witnesses in a few moments will be testifying, Higaro, Robert Higaro, who was in the military for a number of years, and he was interviewed by General Dan Muyunza, who's the director of military intelligence, who said, "We have decided to give you this job, kill General Kayumba and the colonel you just mentioned, Karegeya, who died, of course, and you mentioned that in your testimony as you concluded. And I'm wondering, in a couple of days, a Bishop Romero will be beatified by Pope Francis, who was killed by all indications by a right-wing death squad in El Salvador. I remember I had a meeting with President Duarte during the fight, when the fight was between the FMLN and between, of course, the government. And I, for one, was one of those who believed passionately in strong human rights conditionality, and it was contrary to the Reagan administration. They didn't want it. And I asked President Duarte about that, about the conditionality. And frankly, in an absolute moment of candor and refreshing candor, he said, keep the human rights conditionality. Because there were people, I gleaned from that conversation, even within his own government, that he did not have confidence or trust for. But there's concern that when it comes to Kagame, how high up does this go? Does it go to his level? And you know, when I interviewed and spoke to Robert, who will again be testifying shortly, I asked him about that, and the answer, and he'll tell it in his own words, was not a good one in terms of complicity, if not outright direction from the very top, when it comes to death squads, which both of you in your testimonies have brought great, I think, focus upon. And I thank you again for that candor. You know, it is great to be providing troops for peacekeeping, and it is great to be doing an economic model that seems to be flourishing for some. But I think, as you pointed out, you know, the human rights record is setting a disturbing precedent for the region and the continent. That's very much of an indictment. What we all hoped would be a turning of the page seems to be turning in the opposite direction. And that was, again, your, Mr. Feldstein, that was in your testimony just a moment ago. So I wonder if you could tell us, have you tried to interview Mr. Higuero? He is here, if not now, in the near future. He certainly has been very prominent, and I think he lives in some concern of a potential death squad coming after him, and I say that with great sadness. The others that you mentioned in your testimony, Mr. Ambassador, which I thought was excellent. We expressed concern in January of 2014 about the succession of what appeared to be politically motivated killings of government critics in exile. And then you went through a whole long list. I'm wondering, when we raise that with Paul Kagame, what is the response? Is it denial? Is it, you know, we are committed to tracking down who committed these extrajudicial killings, like in South Africa when they track the colonel down? What has been the response, and could you provide those responses for the record if you don't have it with you today? I'd love to see them. And how high up does it go? I mean, death squads are death squads, and when people are killing critics, we have to be absolutely clear that there is a penalty from our point of view to that kind of behavior. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Allow me to address your second and third questions. As for Mr. Higuera, the State Department has certainly had contact with him. He's well known, and we will continue contacts with him. As for President Kagame's...
Before you go off,
yes.
Leave that. Did you find him credible? Were you able to take any of that information? Was it actionable? He has tape recordings that he shared with the global, a Canadian newspaper, which seems to make a very clear case that they attempted to hire him to do an assassination. He turned it down, not just one but two, again, putting his life at peril. Did you hear those recordings yourself?
I have not heard the recordings, Mr. Chairman. And
anybody at State?
I believe people at State have. Mr. Feldstein may have more information about that.
I don't have personal information on this specific case. I can say in general, we have looked at a number of the different allegations that have been mentioned in testimony today, and we do find a significant amount of those to be credible, enough to warrant further discussion.
What is the response when you from Paul Kagame?
So I think President Kagame has been very clear in his public and private statements, and they've been consistent that he's very concerned about people who he sees in opposition. He appears to distrust any political dissent and freedom of speech, and fears another genocide, Mr. Chairman, which does not in and of itself justify repression, but it's certainly reflective of his mindset.
But in no way is a suitable excuse
I agree.
for killing people. Will you interview our witness in the next panel? And
I will make certain that my colleagues renew their contacts with him, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just add, in terms of how far high up does it go and what are we looking at when it comes to decision-making, I think a lot of that is still somewhat opaque, but I think one of the points that we mentioned is the fact that there have been statements attributed to President Kagame publicly that does talk about the threat inherent to certain actors in terms of what they say and how that affects the country. So I think the rhetoric has been dangerous, and I think the other thing that we do recognize is that in terms of how Rwandan government and the military is organized, it tends to be a fairly tightly controlled group that has very close links to the very top, and so we can make some assumptions that there is at least some knowledge of some of the actions that have been documented in the human rights reports and so forth.
is there any evidence or is there any suspicion on the part of the state that it's coming from the top? I mean, it almost begs credulity that somehow he's not aware of it and perhaps not even directing it.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's a lot of credible evidence suggesting that President Kagame is aware of it. Whether he is ordering it or not is not entirely clear, but certainly he's aware of it, and awareness means that he should act upon it.
And he has not.
And to my knowledge, he has not.
Chairman Royce asked that I ask you a couple of questions with regards to VOA in Rwanda. He sent a letter a couple of weeks ago to the Broadcasting Board of Governors, BBG, expressing deep concern over their plan to end VOA local language broadcasts in Rwanda. And he has asked that I ask you, does the State Department believe radio to be a powerful news medium in Rwanda? Does state support the closure of VOA local language broadcasts there? And do you believe the remaining broadcasts in English and French will reach a broad audience given the fact that large majority still speak Kinyarwanda?
Mr. Chairman, the State Department strongly supports continuation of the broadcasts in Kinyarwanda and Kirundi. We believe that they are very useful, particularly with the closure of the British Kinyarwanda service emissions to Rwanda. And we hope that we can work with the Broadcasting Board of Governors and with this committee to ensure the continuation of those broadcasts.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would echo those sentiments extremely strongly. I think with the closing of the BBC Kinyarwanda service, this is the last international service available to a large portion of Rwandans that is broadcast in Kinyarwanda that they can access and have information, especially as we lead up to some very critical milestones, including the 2017 elections. So I think it's extremely important to allow that access to information, especially given the fact that local sources are more and more self-censored, if not directly censored.
Let me ask you, the South African government has taken legal action against alleged assassins. Have any other governments taken a legal approach in response to killings of Rwandans abroad? For example, have the Belgians reacted in any way?
Not to our knowledge, Mr. Chairman, but the South African investigation of the murder in the hotel room continues.
Can I just ask you, if again Kagame is at least acquiescing to, if not directly complicit in these assassinations and attempted assassinations, what would that do to our response to his government and to him personally?
We are constantly reviewing our relations and possible sanctions against leaders who violate human rights. And Mr. Chairman, I want to be on the record saying that in terms of our cooperation with the Rwandan Armed Forces and Security Services, we ensure that they are vetted in compliance with the Leahy laws for not having committed gross violations of human rights.
But how does that pan out when the Director of Intelligence and other high-ranking military people appear to be complicit in these killings?
The appearance of complicity is the issue, Mr. Chairman, and we're continuing to look into it.
Do we have a task force or a very dedicated group of people trying to ferret out the information on this? Because it seems to me this cries out for, I mean, if he's involved with this, or again, acquiescing to it, or in any way complicit, I mean, these are serious crimes.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think in terms of at least how the connection between the allegations of gross violations of human rights and the assistance that we provide to armed forces, we go through a very stringent vetting process. Every name that either potentially will receive some type of assistance or units that will receive assistance go through a screening process that's done by a team of people, both through post as well as in Washington. It goes through a database, and so far the names that have been submitted have proven to be clean. I do think that when it does come to some of the allegations that are mentioned, I don't think they extend extremely widely into the broader armed forces.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry.
I do think that they tend to be probably more localized in a smaller cohort of people. But we do take very seriously every single allegation, and we are making sure to be very vigilant about ensuring that the assistance that we provide on the security side does conform to Leahy requirements.
Again, I hope when all the information is out, if he is clean, let's ascertain that. But if he's not, and we are, unwittingly aiding and abetting him, that would be we've done that before under administrations of both Republicans and Democrats. And what I'm suggesting is that there needs to be a very aggressive look to see what his complicity is with regards to these extrajudicial killings. And you only have to intimidate so many people to get everyone else to toe the line, or at least mute. We know that with human rights groups not being there, except for perhaps Human Rights Watch, that the reporting becomes less robust because it is that much harder to come by. People are less willing to talk. It has a chilling effect, I would think, on the real snapshot of what is truly going on in Rwanda. I would just ask, Mr. Ambassador, you were somewhat effusive when it came to trafficking and their record in combating human trafficking. I know they have a national plan. I've seen it. But my information suggests that last year they were designated Tier 2 watch list. And you might recall, I wrote that law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I wrote the watch list, which we put in not as a parking lot, but as a between, on the bubble between an egregious violator as well, and those who have a problem and they're at least trying to take some action. I don't see much change from last year to this when it comes to investigations and actions, when it comes to penalties, people getting jail sentences. You can do a lot to put a superficial glean on with a national plan, but if you don't get people who are going to jail and getting real jail time, breaking up brothels, and as you know, the opening statement in the TIP report couldn't be more condemning about Rwanda and forced labor, sex trafficking, and it goes on about how so many of these people are exported to other countries like commodities. I just hope that, and I know there's always a battle between the TIP office and the bureaus, that when it comes to the designation, we will not err on give Kagame a pass, but we will say exactly what is happening on the ground in real terms, not in superficial terms, in terms of having a plan and saying we're doing this, doing that, when in reality it's not being done. I just would urge you, just speak truth to power. What you do in terms of the penalty phase, which we wrote into the law, that shoe drops later, that's largely up to you, if not exclusively up to you. But getting it right, they are Tier 2 watch list now, and that's like a threadbare, or a thread, I should say, an inch away from being an egregious violator as a Tier 3 country. Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. Chairman, the tier and the overall trafficking report for 2014 are still being finalized, so decisions about rankings have not yet been made. However, I can tell you absolutely that there have been prosecutions, there has been a real effort at protection. We understand that more than 3,000 children and women have received benefits of services provided by the Rwandan government in centers for women who have been the victims of gender-based violence, and children who have been in conflict. I think that I'm confident that will be reflected in the report, and I believe statistics about prosecutions will show the trend. I would say that I think what's significant in terms of trafficking in persons is that the Rwandan government has ceased its support for M23 and therefore for M23's child soldiering, and I feel it's important to recognize that. That is a significant change from
I don't
years
think that
past.
should give them an enhanced, I mean, that was so egregious that they were backing M23, that it defies that they got away with it for as long as they did. And Rwanda, as you know, does not offer trafficking-specific aftercare for survivors. And that's a very serious omission, I would respectfully submit, on their part. I'm hoping that my distinguished friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, she wanted to ask some questions. Will be returning shortly. Again, just to reiterate, in a way, you will interview, I hope, our witness as he comes forward in the next panel. And if you could get back to us what Kagame's reaction to our protests, and I assume demarches, and have we gotten to that point where we demarche him on the extrajudicial killings? Have we made I mean, how have we conveyed our displeasure over these killings, assassinations?
Mr. Chairman, I was in a meeting with President Kagame last summer on the margins of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. I can assure you that we raised our human rights concerns with him forthrightly.
And did we do it with specific names of murdered individuals, and for a clear explanation as to what their understanding of it is and whether or not they were complicit in any way? I expect a denial on the complicity part, but you know, it's not until certain colonels and certain people are being indicted and convicted that we can take seriously that they are against extrajudicial killings. And that's exactly what we argued in the 80s with the FMLN and the Duarte government. Okay, where are the convictions? How many people have you grabbed and put behind bars for slaughtering people, including Archbishop Romero? And my understanding is the killers have never been found in that case. So do you get down to that level?
We do not usually get to that level, Mr. Chairman. However, the Human Rights Report documents in great detail individual cases, and I will defer to my colleague here about the release of the next Human Rights Report, but I believe it's imminent.
Yeah, we intend to make an announcement, I think, in the next, in a short period about the release of the Human Rights Report. Really, at this point, it's just been a matter of finding the right moment in the Secretary's schedule to allow that to happen,
Right.
given the importance that we place with having him actually deliver and this year's report.
And could you give me your assurance that you will interview Mr. Higuero and have your relevant staff, if necessary, listen to those recordings because they're devastating?
Yeah, absolutely. I will take that back to my colleagues, and we'll make sure that they connect with him.
Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You are probably aware, Ambassador Jackson, that a few weeks ago I was involved along with Chairman Royce and probably Chairman Smith as well in expressing concerns over the VOA. And I was just wanting to know if you could comment about that, especially if, you know, what you think about that, whether or not we will be able to keep VOA open and on the air in Rwanda.
Congresswoman Bass, as I said to Chairman Smith, I want to assure you that we believe VOA's broadcast in Kinyarwanda and Kirundi provide an enormous service. They are the only source of outside information in local languages for many of the people who listen to them, and we strongly support their continuation.
Well, with that, maybe you could talk about kind of where we are in our relationship with Rwanda, the thrust of U.S.-funded programs to increase civil society. What is the dialogue? I mean, it's often said in these hearings that we send messages to the government about one subject or another, but it's not really clear what the response back is. And I believe Chairman Smith was asking you questions along those lines when unfortunately I had to leave. But it's one thing that we send messages. What are the messages back?
So for fiscal year 2015, we've set aside $2 million for programs on rule of law and civil society strengthening.
And so tell me what that means. Give me an example.
So I don't know. Let me give an example from another country because I don't have the facts for Rwanda in front of me. But for civil society strengthening in Cameroon, where I was last posted overseas, we brought in Freedom House to do seminars, training, to help the civil society groups do fundraising. And one of the really remarkable results of that was that the civil society groups decided to form their own coalitions, because one of the struggles that we've had in Cameroon has been that civil society has been so fractional and divided. So our goals in these programs are to bring people together to advocate for common causes, and I would envision the same type of program in Rwanda. As for rule of law programs, across Africa, we're working with judiciaries to help them to be stronger, more organized, more independent. And
Is that accepted in Rwanda?
I'd have to get back to you on that. And I'd like to defer to my colleague on some of DRL's programming, if I may.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. I would also have to defer in terms of the specifics of the Rwanda program, but we do have a couple different things that we use that are applicable across Africa. These include specific human rights defenders programs that when there are dissidents or activists under duress, we're able to provide needed assistance to help them find safe space. We also have broader civil society strengthening programs. That means trainings outside of the country as appropriate in case to help build their capacity and ability to exert leadership at the right moments. I think one of the challenges in Rwanda, as I mentioned, and as we document in the Human Rights Report, is that they have fairly restrictive NGO registration laws. They watch very carefully the activities of different civil society groups. Anytime a group moves across a sort of an invisible line when it comes to political activity or human rights activity, there tends to be a pretty stern, quiet reaction. And so that has really led to a chilling effect when it comes to the ability of civil society to operate in a free and fair manner. Now, I think there is a broader amount of space available for service provision NGOs who do more development and humanitarian assistance work, and I think that's something that is a positive. But on this sort of more political human rights front, we've had a lot of problems in terms of finding groups that we can work with who aren't subject to the type of restrictions I mentioned.
Can you describe some of the service programs that we fund in Rwanda?
There's a range of those, and I would defer that more towards colleagues at USAID in particular, but in my prior experience, I know they range from health programs to agriculture to other of the sort of standard run of development programs that USAID oversees.
So what about our security assistance to Rwanda, specifically?
Let me address that, Congresswoman Bass. So our security assistance is primarily in terms of peacekeeping training and support for Rwandan peacekeeping. Rwanda is involved in 8 peacekeeping operations with over 5,500 soldiers and police involved in those operations. We, you may recall, suspended at the direction of this Congress our international military education and training programs in 2012. The plan is to resume those this year, but so our security assistance has been focused on supporting Rwanda's deployments in peacekeeping
What
operations.
are we resuming this year?
International military education and training.
What does that mean?
So this is primarily bringing officers and enlisted men from Rwanda to the United States for specific training programs.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's always confusing to me about our policy, because, you know, we're going to criticize the government for their human rights record, and then we're going to train their military. So, you know, it's like, which one is it?
I respectfully submit that you need to do both. And it's important to train the military in order to make sure that they do not commit gross violations of human rights and that they are effective peacekeepers.
Yeah, it's just that it seems like some of the time it doesn't turn out that way, right? So I would like to ask, not to put you on the spot here, but maybe you could get back to me with some of the specific democracy programs. And then I'm also interested in to what extent we fund Rwandans versus fund U.S. contractors to do work in Rwanda. How much of it goes to NGOs that Rwandans run?
I will have to get back to you on that.
No, that's what I was asking.
And
I know that you don't know that now. You made reference, I believe, Ambassador Jackson, in your opening remarks to Burundi, and I was wondering if you could expand on that in terms of what is happening, obviously in relation to Rwanda. But I don't remember exactly what you said. I want you to expand on it.
So in Burundi, we see protests continuing following the coup attempt. The protests have now gone on ever since President Nkurunziza's party nominated him for a third term, and he
I'm
registered.
sorry, I don't think I was clear. I was meaning specifically Rwanda's role. I'm familiar with what's going on.
Rwanda's role in Burundi has been very constructive from my point of view. President Kagame has been very outspoken about the need for President Nkurunziza to respect the Arusha Accord, and Rwanda has been very welcoming to refugees. President Kagame has participated in the meetings with other regional leaders to attempt to persuade President Nkurunziza to restart dialogue with the opposition and create an environment that will be conducive to free and fair elections.
And by the way, the general that attempted the coup?
General Niambari's whereabouts, as far as I know, remain unknown.
Was he one of the ones we trained?
Pardon?
Was he one of the ones we trained?
I'd have to get back to you. I'm not aware.
Okay, thank you.
Follow up on my friend's question. With IMET being resumed or in the process of being resumed, Robert Higero today will testify and will reiterate what he has said before, that the Director of Military Intelligence, Colonel Dan Munyuza, was the one who, and he's got this on tape, said, "We have decided to give you this job. You have to go to South Africa and take out General Kayumba and Colonel Karegeya." Now, my question is, when we're doing training, and as you said, it's officers as well as others, will this man be left out of that training? I mean, it seems to me that if this is true, he ought to be indicted for conspiracy to commit murder. Is that on your radar screen? Do you know this man, the colonel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is one of those cases that it precisely falls into the Leahy vetting requirements. So for anyone who would be submitted by the Rwandan government for participation in the IMET program, we would extensively go through all the different allegations that are there, different public accusations and so forth, assess the credibility, and then make a determination about whether this person would be barred or not by law. I think with a person like this who is so publicly connected to some of the allegations that we've discussed, I would assume that that name wouldn't come forward in any way.
Let me ask you, if I could, is Colonel Dan Munyuza, do you know of him? He's the Director of Military Intelligence.
It's a name I'm familiar with. I haven't
What's your
personally
take
met
on
him.
him? Is this a credible allegation?
I think
He's the one on the tape who is saying, and the BBC carried this, and of course the Canadian newspaper, that we can listen to it if you'd like, that he was trying to hire Higero for this assassination.
I think the allegations carry a lot of weight. I think when it comes to the investigations taking place in South Africa related to this incident, we're waiting to see where the judicial process
But again,
goes.
what are we doing regarding this man? I mean, does our military intelligence, does our State Department interface with him as well? I mean, if he is an alleged killer, an assassinator, or at least someone who puts people up to it, what is your view of this man?
From a democracy standpoint, I have not had any contact with him, and I couldn't answer for other colleagues on that. I'm not sure.
Mr. Jackson?
I have not had any direct contact with him, and given the nature of our training programs, I would have to get back to you to see if there is any contact, Mr. Chairman.
Could you? It's very
Yes.
important. We will make that a part of the record. Okay. Ms. Bass, anything else?
No, thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, gentlemen. We'll have some additional questions, so we'll submit for the record. But it is disconcerting to me that Director of Military Intelligence has made these kinds of allegations, have allegations pending against him, and, you know, you have to get back to me on that, back to us as a committee. I wish you would have known that. And I wish something would, you know, if it is true, and maybe it's not credible, but, you know, it would appear that when you get a phone message and it's recorded, we have methods and ways to ascertain whether or not it's an accurate tape recording. So please get back. I'd like to now welcome our second panel, and thank you again, gentlemen. Beginning with Mr. David Himbara, who is an educator, political economist, and author currently working as a consultant focusing on African economic reform. A Rwanda native, Mr. Himbara spent a total of 6 years working for President Paul Kagame as head of strategy and policy in the Office of the President and the principal private secretary to the President. Tasked with improving national competitiveness, Mr. Himbara spearheaded efforts that ultimately improved Rwanda's ranking in the World Bank's annual Doing Business report, 143rd to 67 out of 183 countries. Prior to his time in Rwanda, he was based in South Africa working pardon me, as a private consultant. But then hear from Major Robert Higaro, who served as an officer in the Rwandan military from 1990 to the year 2010. Major Higaro ran several training operations and commanded troops in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the African Union's peacekeeping force in Sudan, among other missions. Last year, the Canadian newspaper The Globe and Mail reported that Major Higaro was one of several men hired to assassinate Rwandan dissenters living in exile. Despite living in exile thousands of miles from Rwanda, he remains concerned about his own security and believes that he is being hunted. We'll then hear from Mr. Willis Shalida, who is a Rwandan-American freelance photojournalist and writes about African affairs. In 1999, on the 5th anniversary of the genocide against the Tutsi, he wrote an opinion editorial that was recognized by the San Francisco Chronicle as the best national opinion editorial of the year. He is a retired special investigator from the California State Bar. We'll also hear from Ms. Sarah Margon, who is the Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she was an Associate Director of Sustainable Security and Peace Building at the Center for American Progress, where she researched and wrote on a wide range of issues, including human rights, foreign aid, good governance, and global conflicts and crises. She also served in the Senate as Staff Director of the Senate Subcommittee on African Affairs, been a Senior Policy Advisor to Oxfam America, and worked at the Open Society Institute. She also testified before this subcommittee on several times, so welcome back, Mr. Himbara.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Smith. Ranking Member Bass, it's my